just to give you a little background, I've done a lot of work looking at mapping of the United States, more in health, and looking at variation in delivery of health. And the maps match exactly what you showed, Robert, not surprisingly. So I don't know if it's the Rust Belt or whatever area you want to call it. And it's interesting that large corporations have also done those maps about where they want to set up new stores in various communities. And yet I'd like to know from both of you what's kind of being done, if anything. I mean, these things have been going on for decades and decades, and I hear your voices, but I'm not sure those voices are causing the kind of change that's necessary. And so as we, as a committee, think about this, obviously a picture's worth 1,000 words, and you can look at any one of those maps and get the same story over and over and over again. But I don't know what's happening in your minds at a national level to create the change that's necessary.
Oh. Well, I think the problem is having the facts has never been enough to get action. And those communities, when you have those facts, you have those maps, it's hard to argue with those data. But those data are not enough. You have to have communities that are organized, mobilized, and ready to take action. And too often, the communities that are in greatest need don't have the organization capacity or infrastructure in place to take those information and move the policy. That's why I think it's important to have institutions that collaborate with communities, community university partnerships, and other kinds of collaborations that can support those communities and assist those communities to speak for themselves. And we are getting change, but it's very incremental because, as you said, big corporations can do those maps, and they can look at, they can go to the voter registration, and they can go to the areas and look at participation in government, et cetera, and they can find and map and come up with some very good models of where the least resistance is. And too often that's how it happens. And so what we've had to do, what the environmental justice has had to do, is try to level that playing field where those spots that are the likely candidates can get that information to say, well, these are the kinds of things that we want. We want jobs, we want economic development, but we also don't want it at the expense of our health. And a lot of communities are actually saying and calculating out, teasing out the promise of a job, which is very different than a job. And when many of these industries go in, they promise 500 jobs, but maybe 500 jobs in building the facility, but the permanent jobs may only end up being 50 jobs. When you explain that and you walk through that with communities, they will say, well, and of that 50 jobs, the locals may only get 4 jobs because the facility, state-of-the-art, may be bringing 45 of its own techs. It's a matter of how external organizations can assist and support the communities that are at greatest need, and that's the challenge.
But you'd think through the National Governors Association, maybe I'm just naive, right? I am. Okay. So
I didn't say that.
I am. And we'll hear what Mary Ann says, but you'd think that this is something that, you know, at the federal, state level, that there could be policies that start to change these things given, you know, Act 6 or whatever it is, the legal documents. And I'm dumbfounded why we as a nation haven't taken more action.
That's the purpose of this meeting.
Yeah. So let me jump in. I feel like your question could start us at another half hour because it's a rich question. And it is easy to look at the map and also to go to a place like Uniontown and just get frustrated. It's Uniontown was promised $4 million, $1 for every ton of coal ash. And first of all, so what? But second of all, it never came to Uniontown. God knows, or somebody knows, where that money went. And there are very few people in Uniontown who would say that was a good thing, or even at the time thought that they were going to get that money. So there was no trade-off. There was no even education that, very little education that was needed. And it's not a question of jobs versus, versus health. There is just it's a bleak picture, except for the activism of the people. But I will say I have reason for hope, and I think there are policies that can change. Some of the reasons, I mean, what gives me hope is the people who are speaking out all the time. But on top of that, I think we are at a unique moment right now. I think the record of what's happened in Flint has caught the public imagination. And it's caught the public imagination right at the time that the Black Lives Matter movement has also caught the public imagination. And as a civil rights lawyer, we've been fighting for 20 years against this very well-funded frame of intentional discrimination, that you wouldn't recognize a disparity if it hit you in the face unless someone, there was a memo that said we want to do harm to a people of color or something like that. There isn't a memo in most places, and we have to recognize unconscious actions. We know that drives so much of what we do, and we have to recognize structural discrimination, and that the effects of what happens are more important for the person who is lying in the street, or for the community living in the shadow of a mountain of coal ash. So I feel like the frame in which people are understanding these issues is shifting a little bit, and it creates this moment of opportunity. But the communities need technical assistance. They need credible spokespeople, and they're credible, but they need spokespeople who can rebut the attack on them, because they are devalued when they speak out. I'm seeing that in Uniontown right now, where the landfill is saying, what's the proof? It's a little bit like one of the political candidates who said, Trump University, what's the proof? We hear that over and over, and they're discredited. So we need to think about those policies. And the final thing in terms of policy that I'll say is, in other areas of civil rights, agencies have, I won't say they've done a spectacular job of enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There are a lot of problems in the Department of Education, and certainly U.S. Department of Agriculture, Interior. But having worked in some of those areas, I can think of no agency where the performance has been lower than the Environmental Protection Agency. So we have an area where there are gross disparities and decisions made every day that affect life itself for communities, and an absolute lack of a culture of civil rights enforcement and accountability. And I think there is reason for working in this space. I think there is an opportunity for making change. We'll have to see what the next administration holds. There are opportunities in some states, depending on the Attorney General, where the Attorney Generals can enforce Title VI. And there's been so little done, there's an opportunity to do a lot more.
I'd like to also make another point, is that environmental justice is not only about the negative, nasty pollution. It's also making sure that communities that have historically not got its fair share of the good stuff, the parks, the playgrounds, green schools, the good transit, affordable, accessible, access to those things that make communities healthy, access to clinics and all those things. And so we're finding now that more of our environmental justice communities now are mapping the dollars, following the dollars, and we are training a lot of communities to do that locally, to find out where the money is going that comes to your area. You track the money whether after a major disaster. You track the money, or whether it's when referendums are passed to bring parks and recreational facilities, etc. They need to follow the dollars. Before they did, a lot of this, local folks didn't have the capacity to do the GIS, to map and to track. But now we're giving them those skills so they can do it themselves. We don't have to parachute in and do whatever.
Yeah,
Robert, you're first.
yeah. I'd like to. I'm not an attorney, but I want to know, beyond just Title VI and discrimination. It seems to me that you're describing kinds of assault, and particularly on young people. I'm wondering why and particularly with respect to, say, our mandate, which is public health, are we talking about a kind of threat that's akin to terrorism? It seems to me that we are talking about something that is like terrorism. I think it is, we are talking about something that is maybe not murder, but it is assault. So that's one question. The second sort of technical question is, when you say that Title VI says no American can be discriminated on these bases, it only applies to current Americans, it doesn't apply to future Americans. In other words, there's no concept of a generational, multi-generational concept of who is covered by a statute.
Yeah, I'll start with that last question, and I don't know if you want to take the assault question.
Yeah.
Although I will say that there was a lawsuit in the Midwest about these industrial agriculture facilities where I think they survived a motion to dismiss on an assault theory that neighbors who were in the pathway of receiving all these emissions from one of the, and I hope y'all know that when I'm talking about the confined animal feeding operations, I'm not talking about the big red barn. I'm talking about an entire, 5,000 pigs or whatever, 100,000 cattle. The pigs are all inside; they never go outside. We can talk about that, but. And they did they did use an assault theory, so that's kind of interesting. But Title VI importantly says no person, so it is not limited to citizens or Americans. It is like most civil rights law. It protects everyone. It protects, there is no, people often talk about protected classes or protected groups. There is no in and out. The Equal Protection Clause applies to us all, and there's some behavior that's illegitimate, and and we can't countenance. And so it protects white as well as black or Latino or Asian American or Native American, and it protects all people. Now, the other question is, does it protect the unborn, or going forward? And there isn't much case law on that. I will say that risks associated with risky behavior with exposure to toxics are a legitimate form of impact. And so that is certainly something that could be contemplated in discussing risk. One of the technical issues that EPA struggles with, just to share with you some of the challenges of working before EPA, is that they don't currently recognize a lot of the impacts that communities feel.
If this group were to, for whatever reason, if the member of this group offered a view that equity in public health required consideration of the impact of whatever is done, pollution or anything else, family policy, whatever, education, if it doesn't take into effect the implications for the unborn, the analysis is incomplete. If that view were offered, would it be laughable?
I don't think it would be laughable. I think if it's put in the context of risk, for example, it could be a contribution. I would say that there's a larger context here of taking account of all impacts and not artificially limiting impacts, and that would be an important contribution.
On the first question, I wrote, in working on the Dixon County, Tennessee case, I wrote an article called Toxic Terror in a Tennessee Town, the poster child for environmental racism. And the scenario that I gave was if I would climb the tower in Dixon and dump TCE in the water tower, I would be labeled a toxic terrorist and would be taken to jail. And so we were framing it in the context of the community not knowing what waking up not knowing what's wrong with them, and not knowing what hit them, and having and being afraid, that is a form of terror. And I think there's so many communities that live fence line to these facilities where, just like this, if an explosion occurs, they're dead. And there have been some very nasty explosions that have wiped out, like in West Texas, that plant, fertilizer plant, just wiped out the whole town. It is a form of terror, and it's and in terms of the health effects, not knowing, that's stressful, and so it's mental stress. There are lots of issues involved, and that's not too far-fetched in terms of your question.
Thank you for both of your presentations. As a non-lawyer, framing it that way, the legal strategy you just are describing sound fairly downstream to me. If you thought about upstream in the agency decision-making, can you just help me understand perhaps what some of the structures are in place that are driving some of the decisions that have these disparate impacts, other than the unconscious bias one? Sort of what is driving these decisions, and could one address those potentially in addition to the downstream?
I think there are two pieces to a driver: what is constraining and what is driving. And so I want to talk about one, and there are probably many, many others. I think we're operating in the environmental space in a lawless world where, in education and healthcare, they were around in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. They used the Civil Rights Act to desegregate the schools, to not perfect by any stretch, but there was a culture of using it. EPA was birthed in the 70s. It does not have that culture. It never was effective at enforcing Title VI. It not once has found a recipient of federal funds in non-compliant with the law. Not once. It made one preliminary finding.
Is it really about how they make their decisions that drives that? Are they not looking at factors
Yes.
that agencies are? Okay.
Yes. So there are a lot of reasons, which again could be a whole. I'm happy to brief the commission, and Robert Garcia knows a lot about this too. I want to get back to your question, but one key problem is that they are looking at the question of whether there's an impact. They will not find impacts cognizable. They won't recognize impacts. Let's say impacts on water, impacts on air, unless they find a violation of their environmental standards. So unless you find a violation of the Clean Water Act, they don't recognize the impact. Unless you find a violation of the Clean Air Act, they don't recognize an impact. So you got a problem there. So that's one of many constraints. But to kind of get back to the first question you asked, without the recognition that you'll be held accountable if you take federal money, without feeling some kind of accountability, state governments, local governments, and other recipients of federal fund don't think that they have to comply with the law. It was only last year that EPA made it a requirement when recipients got federal funds that they had to check off whether they were complying with Title VI. And they thought that was a huge victory, that we've now not made it optional anymore to check that off. Every other agency, nobody makes it optional. So there was a gross lawlessness in this space, and I think one of the reasons that states and local governments didn't take this into account is nobody was telling them to. Now, I think we have there are other better reasons than that. They might argue we didn't have the tools. We didn't know what the racial composition of the community was. There are a lot of other reasons. EPA has now produced EJ Screen. California has its own Enviro Screen that makes it kind of one-stop shopping to find what the demographics of the community are. So we also, going back to the earlier question, we have reasons for optimism because some of the excuses that have been given over the last 20 years are really no longer hold because some of these tools have been made available.
Could I give an example of how these kinds of things happen in terms of communities of color and poor communities basically getting just systematically dumped on, and oftentimes it's not even thought to be an issue. After the BP spill, and when all that oil was cleaned up in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida, those 4 states were selected to be the disposal site for the waste. And the state, and so the Unified Command, that is the EPA and Army Corps of Engineers and the Coast Guard, just came together and decided, had the states to decide where they're going to send all of this waste. Well, the state of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Florida decided to send it to the landfills. Well, the landfills are located in black communities in those states. And so 60% of the waste was going to the land. We calculated this now, not the government. We had a meeting, communities called a meeting because they want to know why all these trucks rolling through their neighborhoods. And we asked the Unified Command, where's the waste going? And they said it's going into the states. We said, where's the landfill? They said, we don't know. And so I went back to my office. I had my GIS person to start cranking out the numbers to get the waste numbers off of BP's website. It wasn't on EPA's. All the stuff was on BP's website. And so we would, every 2 weeks, we would get the waste, and the amount, the volume, etc. And then we would plot it where the waste was going. When we presented that information to the government, they said, well, and we showed that 60% of the waste was going into black communities, and blacks only made up like 20% of the coastal counties were that was impact area. We said, well, the executive order on environmental justice covers FEMA and all these federal agencies. This is not fair, and so they said, no, it's not fair. There was one landfill in Mississippi that was a white area. The white community kicked up so much dust, they got their landfill off the list, and so the waste went up even further. The Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA and the Coast Guard, and those folks said that the admiral wrote a letter to the state, said, you cannot come off the list because we have to ensure that no community is disproportionately impacted by X, Y, and Z. After that memo, the waste started to be more evenly distributed. Now, environmental justice had never advocated equal distribution of poison, but what we were saying is that black communities in this area should not bear the burden for this man-made disaster. And so that's an example where the government officials didn't even know where the waste was going. They just gave it to the states. Now, the state of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Florida has never been leading the pack when it comes to civil rights and justice. And you allow them to do it, and we said no. So that's an example where it's just been, that's the way they've done business for so long, and so it's almost like, well, it's natural to do this.
I just want to add one thing before we go forward, which is another reason for hope or idea that policy can make a difference here. As Dr. Bullard was saying, the federal government hasn't been out front on a lot of this as well. They make more noise about it, but they haven't integrated analysis, environmental justice analysis, into their decision making. Over the last 7 years at EPA and certainly at the Department of Justice, we see steps in that direction. Now, you'd like to think that we are further along than we are, but for the first time, there's in EPA's rulemaking, they've actually done environmental justice analyses under the Environmental Justice Executive Order that was signed by President Clinton. They should have been doing it all along, and it's not at all. They're not doing it, you know, in a way that where your criteria are transparent. But it is a step in the right direction. In the rule that's called the definition of solid waste, in the rule governing the classification of coal ash, they did an environmental justice analysis, and we're all tussling over how did they do it, what are the terms, how are they using it, but using it is a starting point for making change.
Thank you both. So there's clearly a front end issue and there's a back end issue, right? So how do we get good things into our community? How do we keep bad things out? And then if bad things come in, how do we push back? What I'm wondering is, thinking about communities as possible bulwarks, right, or advocates for themselves. Could you say a bit more about what some promising models may be on each of those? And it seems that the front end is where much of the action is, right, as opposed to having to sort of do remedial stuff. So Bob, you talked about community university partnerships. So whether actual or hypothetical, right, and thinking about replicability, right, what are some of the things the most promising models on each of those points, front end and back end, that you'd like to see lifted up?
Well, on the front end, I'm biased in this because I think community university partnerships and community-based participatory research and training community leaders, organizers, individuals, intergenerational. For me, I've seen the best, doing this for the last 35 years, it seems to have the most lasting impact and to be the most promising when it comes to sustainability. And the idea of having a university that has a stake in the community, whether it's or in the state or the region, really forming a partnership with those communities and organizations, NGOs that are under-resourced, but also to assist them in building that capacity so that they can take it to the next level and to replicate it across their city, across their county, and the region. Those approaches, for a long time, were given high priority and funded, 15 years ago. But at some point, the funding dropped off, and the capacity of a lot of these organizations and these communities kind of slacked off. I think if we can assist and support what I call a community-based organization accelerator incubator for those organizations that are in the community but may not have the capacity at the level to do the kinds of things that I'm talking about, that the university partner can assist and support to get them at that level. Where there is no organization, where there's a major gap, that's where you need the incubator to assist in community and birthing an organization. Could come out of the faith base or could come wherever to assist them to get their legs and to move up. There are lots of gaps in our communities. There are very few people of color organizations working on the issues that we're talking about. You have lots of organizations working on issues, but when you start crosswalking the various issues and making health at the center, the organizations thin out. And there are very few organizations that cut across the various sectors and disciplines of color. That's a major, for me, that's a major gap, and given the changing demographics, it seems that we need to be growing and putting resources and investing in that emerging majority in terms of the U.S. That to me is would be the most promising model to an approach to kind of like look at as something within that top three.
So I'll try to rattle off a few quick ones. I work a lot on toxics, and we haven't really talked about the underregulation of toxics and the lack of information about toxics, which then informs this discussion, because it's much easier to criticize the community-based experience if we don't have information. I worked on dispersants in the Gulf in the wake of the BP disaster, as an example. And, we just didn't have knowledge of what was in these chemical dispersants. And a lot of what we did was just try to get that information. And that goes back to how we're regulating the chemical industry and what needs to be done there. But I think there are some new movements that are worth looking at. I'm part of a group called Cancer-Free Economy that's funded by the Garfield Foundation to really look at how we change the paradigm of cancer the economy from cancer-causing chemicals to safer, greener chemicals. And one area where there's a lot more that needs to be done in the vein that Dr. Bullard is saying is, low-income communities of color that are feeling the brunt of this can't afford to be part of those movements. Some can, but not very many in a meaningful way. And so there's an area of opportunity to lift up those groups to make sure they have the technical capacity to be part of that solution. 2, equity analyses. I talked about them before. Critical that we should be doing equity analyses. Who's involved in that? How do we do it? Great practice. There's some great stuff going on in California under their what are called Little NEPA laws. We have to look at how to do it efficiently, and then how to ensure that policymakers, decision makers are actually doing the equity analysis. 3, skipping to the back end. Those are front end. Skipping to the back end, I mentioned Corpus Christi. Why has that been successful? What is Department of Transportation doing to actually enforce the law? And how can communities and researchers and advocates be more effective at this form of addressing some of the problems at the back end? And then finally, it's so important in policy to really be explaining to the American public how science works, because a lot of these efforts are undermined by this concept that there's uncertainty. And of course, we all know there's always uncertainty, right? Until we know the better thing, the more updated information. And yet, uncertainty is used to discredit any concerns that communities have. And so there, I think, are better practices and opportunities for really explaining how science works in all this.
Okay, we're going to have our final question from Bill, and I appreciate that there are a lot of questions for our panelists, and we have to go with the committee first. There will be time for public comment at the end of the day, and we can also raise and bring back questions that weren't gotten to from our attendees at that time, too. So.
Are you both saying that the first best vehicle for improving health equity in the environmental sphere is local community activization?
Do you want to start?
Yes. Having the communities that are closest to the issue have that information, be informed, have the capacity to work on issues at various levels, whether it's research, whether it's policy, or whether it's mobilization, etc. That's very important. Most of the examples, success stories that I've seen over the last 30 years, that's a major ingredient. It was a major ingredient down in Corpus Christi, and I worked with the folks down in Corpus. And to have strong leaders that are committed for the long haul and who are concerned, I think that's and have some level of capacity to stay with these issues and concerns, because oftentimes they are. It takes a while. It's a long term. It's not a sprint.
I think my answer is very similar. It's a yes, but. Or maybe it's a no. And the no is only because it's, yes, local community activization is really important, but no, because on its own, without technical assistance, without enforcement of the law, without the appropriate policies, communities continue to be ignored. And so, without lawyers, without researchers, without all of those pieces, we have the last 20 years of experience where communities have been engaged. I don't want to leave the impression that they have been apathetic. How many times have we all been called by communities who know what their experience is, but people close the doors in their faces? So it can't be by itself. It has to be with law enforcement. It has to be with civil rights enforcement. It has to be with the HBCUs. And so that's part of a more holistic understanding of what drives change.
But the attack via the state or federal level, I guess you're saying, is not as important or as likely to have an effect as it is at the local, as a well-supported local community effort.
So that's a different question in my mind. What are the strategies, and then where are the strategies best located? I'm not really taking a position on whether the best level for change is local, state, or federal. I actually am not sure I agree it's always local, because sometimes, let's look at Uniontown. Those county commissioners, I don't know who got those $4 million, but it was in Uniontown. And those county commissioners didn't seem very amenable to local input. I'm not sure that's the locus for change. I want to see meaningful civil rights enforcement, meaningful support at EPA. I want to see the Alabama Department of Environmental Management change the way it does permitting and change its policy making so it too is in compliance with the law. And yes, there are opportunities at the local level, but I think the question of tactics, where you want to see change, it has to happen throughout. We want to lift up and include and provide technical assistance to local activists, but they need to work at local, state, and federal levels.